Pleasure to be here today to welcome Claire McGettrick, who is going to present our final gender arc summary of the semester. My name is Dr. Maggie O'Neill. I'm from Gender Arc. So just to introduce Claire, Claire is an Irish Research Council postgraduate scholar at the School of Sociology in UCD. Her PhD research is examining how adopted adults and children have been classified and defined in discourses of expert knowledge, and how they have been managed in adoption policy and practice. This study will also reconstruct the progression of formal and informal adoption in Ireland, from the establishment of the boarding out system in 1862 to the present day. Claire is also an adopted person and survivors' rights advocate. She is co-founder of Justice for Magdalenes, now JFM Research, and Adoption Rights Alliance. She coordinates the Magdalene Name Project, which she's going to speak to us about today. This project has recorded the details of over 1,600 women who lived and died behind laundry walls. Claire also jointly coordinates the CLON project on behalf of JFM Research and Adoption Rights Alliance in association with the global law firm Hogan Lovells. The project provides free statement drafting assistance to witnesses who wish to give evidence to the Mother and Baby Homes Commission of Investigation. So today, as I said, Claire is going to speak to us about the Magdalene Name Project. Thank you.
So I'm just going to very quickly, to start off, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the laundries and a little bit of background on just Magdalenes Research as an organisation, and then on about the Names Project work. Feel free to stop me at any stage if you have a question. I'm conscious you guys might need to get back to work after this, so and I'll kind of try and whiz through things as swiftly as possible, so that we've time for questions. Okay, so the Magdalene Laundries, they were institutions that were originally philanthropic, but they were increasingly carceral, particularly after the foundation of the state. These institutions were attached to convents that were operated by female religious, where women who were called penitents worked at laundry and other for-profit enterprises, for example needlework, lace making here in Limerick, etc. Importantly, these institutions, they're neither uniquely Irish nor are they uniquely Catholic. In terms of the conditions of the laundries, the women were denied freedom of movement. They were returned by the Gardaí if they escaped. They were never paid for their labour. They were denied their given names. The daily routine emphasised prayer, silence and work. Survivors were called hair cutting, deprivation of food and water as punishments. They had to be signed out of the Magdalene, or you could just be told one day, look, you're going. That's it, but without warning. Many remained to live, work and ultimately die behind convent walls. After 1922, the laundries were operated by 4 orders: the Sisters of Mercy, Sisters of Our Lady of Charity of Refuge, the Sisters of Charity and the Good Shepherds. These orders were all involved in other residential institutions. They're all members of CORI and party to the indemnity deal arising out of the Residential Institutions Redress Board. So where are they located? They're in Galway, Dunleary, Waterford, New Ross here in Limerick, Cork, that's the 4 Good Shepherd laundries, Donnybrook and Cork, Sisters of Charity, and then in Drumcondra and Gloucester Street / Sean McDermott Street in Dublin. And the last Magdalene laundry only closed in 1996. So if you want to see a map of the various laundries, we have a map of each laundry location as best as we can kind of pinpoint it and each grave location that we're aware of up on our website, and I'll make a resources document available to Maggie after this so that she can disseminate it for anybody that's interested. So the survivors are those affected by the issue fall into 5 groups from our perspective. So there are survivors who speak out and demand justice. There are many survivors who still live in silence. The shame and stigma is just still there, despite the state apology even. There are the survivors, over 100 women who are currently living in institutionalised settings still under the control of the religious orders. There are the women who died, both inside and outside the convent. And finally, there are the family members, many of whom are adopted people, which is how, partly how Justice for Magdalenes was founded. It was founded by 3 adopted women, including myself, 2 of whom, my mother wasn't in a laundry, but the other 2, both their mothers were in laundries. For one woman was a combination of different laundries for 50 years. In terms of a bit of background about ourselves, we were founded in 2003, as I say, by 3 adopted people, on foot of the revelations about the excavations at Hyde Park, which I won't get into detail at this stage. I'll be getting into much more detail later about that. We grew out of the original Magdalene Memorial Committee, which had been founded in '93, ironically because of the excavations that were taking place at that time. And the original members came together with us in 2003 to sort of get us going. Again, once Mary Raftery's piece ran about the circumstances at Hyde Park with the excavations. JFM was a survivor advocacy group, totally volunteer run and not-for-profit. Our political campaign began in 2009 because up until then we kind of didn't have the wherewithal to have a political campaign, because we were just kind of, there was a closed door every time we went to knock on it. And it wasn't until Jim Smith came along, Professor Jim Smith from Boston College came along with evidence of state involvement in the laundries, that finally people started to sit up and take notice. And so a new organisation now is JFM Research, which we founded in the era post 2013, after the apology, because our original aims and objectives were, number 1, to bring about an apology, and number 2, to establish a compensation scheme for Magdalene survivors. And once we achieved those aims, we felt that it would behove us to kind of signal a moving on from that campaigning phase and then towards more a transitional justice phase through the new organisation. And so now what we do now is we provide for the advancement of education of the general public by researching the laundries and by providing information to Magdalene survivors and their families. And the other part of the work is to leave a legacy, to ensure that the public record is accurate, and in terms of bringing supporting survivors and their families. I'm not going to get into too much about the restorative justice scheme, but I felt it was just important just to have one quick mention of it today, because the Ombudsman's report investigating the scheme is going to be published this Thursday. We don't know what is in the report. From what we've seen to date in the media from the Ombudsman, and just the back and forth in court that has gone on, it would appear that it is going to be quite a critical report. If you want to just read up on our criticisms of the scheme, just go to our website. That's a bit of a long address there, but if you go to our website, jfmresearch.com, and click on restorative justice and then restorative justice scheme, you can find out the different problems with the scheme. Because we just probably won't have time today to get into it. But as I say, just to flag it, because it's kind of coming up this week. So the Magdalenes report, it established statement involvement. However, It didn't investigate fully or make findings and recommendations in relation to abuse and maltreatment in the laundries. It was not a truth-finding investigation. There was no public call for testimony. It ignored written testimony submitted via JFM, and from what we've been told by survivors, it didn't accurately portray the lived experience of the women. It failed to examine all records, and it was misleading in its account of duration of stay, and I'll go into that more in a minute, and it failed to adequately investigate deaths. We submitted 796 pages of testimony to the Magdalenes Committee, and none of it appeared in the report. In our testimonies, all of the survivors, without exception, said they couldn't leave. Some said they begged to leave every day, but they were refused. The doors were locked, the windows were inaccessible. They were returned by the Gardaí if they tried to escape. They couldn't complain because they kind of looked at us when we were taking the testimonies, when we'd ask, did you complain? And they'd say, well, who would you complain to? How would you do that? They were never paid, and there were no inspections or visits from government officials. And also, crucially, the survivors and the witnesses who gave testimony via ourselves, they, without exception, offered accounts of various types of physical abuse in the Magdalene laundries, and that's in addition to the fact of being locked up against your will, by the way. However, the state's current position and repeated position is that no factual evidence to support allegations of systematic torture or ill treatment of a criminal nature was found. In light of facts uncovered by Magdalenes, and in the absence of any credible evidence of systematic torture and criminal abuse being committed in the laundries, the government doesn't propose to set up a specific Magdalene inquiry body. So in spite of everything, in spite of all we know, and I mean, it's very clear the women are entirely credible. That's something that, has been said by people like Judge Quirk, who set up the Magdalene Commission to recommend a scheme. The women are unanimous in their testimony, even though they don't know each other. But this is the state's current and repeated position on abuse in the laundries. So part of what we do as kind of as a kind of a counter narrative to that, we support initiatives, and we try and do our best from our own perspective, to ensure that there's public access to survivor testimony. So, we would have been closely, involved in support of the Magdalene Oral History Project, which was funded by the Irish Research Council and housed in UCD. That's Professor Catherine O'Donnell, the principal investigator, and actually that's, as we're in Limerick, that's actually in the White House pub in Limerick. We were down here. Pauline very kindly invited us to speak about the Oral History Project, and we stopped off for a drink at the pub, and I think Catherine thought I was having an episode or something, because I was just looking up and I could see ledgers, and it turned out it were the Good Shepherd ledgers from, they're up behind the bar. I don't know if they're still there, but they were, at that stage anyway, they were up behind the bar. Two of the ledgers that had been sold off by the nuns after the college, or after they sold it to the college. So we have, thanks to Evelyn Glynn and Una Spain, we have them digitised. And so the Magdalene Names Project. So the aims of the project are to honour the women and girls who lived and died in the laundries, to encourage active memorialisation. I know a lot of survivors, for some survivors I think a statue or some sort of a physical memorial would be important, but I think it's also important to make sure that we actively and continuously remember what happened, because we cannot draw any kind of a line under what happened, because we are repeating history as we speak in direct provision. We are, all the time. We haven't learned. We haven't learned from what happened, and so we must engage with what happened and do so rigorously, and ask why it happened and how it possibly could have, could be that so many women and girls were locked up against their will. And so things like the Oral History Project, things like the Names Project, where you can read the how many were there, what did their lives look like, how long were they there. So yeah, we want to also ensure accurate records at the burial sites. I don't think I'm going to have time to get into. There is literally so much around this issue of deaths at the laundries that the inaccuracies at the High Park graves and Gloucester Street graves in Glasnevin alone are staggering. They're just staggering. We've got an example of just like 3 headstones in one place in Glasnevin Cemetery, and there are 51 names on that gravestone, but not one of those women named on the headstones are actually buried at that location. They're all buried around the corner in a different location. We have absolutely no idea who's actually buried in that one spot in Glasnevin. We have another location further up the graveyard where there are 188 names on the grave, but I could only find 33 of them, actually buried at that location. Others are scattered all over the graveyard, and it's just the lack of care and just the negligence is just incredible. It's staggering. So I unfortunately I don't think I can fit that in today, but I can give you, just to give you a flavour. Again, in the resources document that I'll give Maggie, I'll give a link to our critique of chapter 16 of the Magdalenes report, which outlines sort of all of this stuff, and there's even more since, but that'll give you an idea of if you want to read more. And something I will get into today, finally, we want to ensure that there's accurate public record of duration of stay. So the kind of work that I do on this project is, at its simplest, it's photographing Magdalene graves and databasing every single one of the names. Gathering census records. Unfortunately, we just have 2 census records to choose from, 1901 and 1911. It'll be interesting if 26 comes out to see what's there. Exhumation license for High Park. The electoral registers is one of the kind of newer areas we've been getting into. Newspaper archives have also been very helpful to kind of corroborate. You'd often see where a woman would have been sent in by the courts and she's named, and essentially a lot of the work, apart from just simply documenting the various names of the women and how old they were, and as much as we can find, we also do a lot of comparative analysis between, say, the graves, the census, the exhumation licenses, the electoral registers, and that gives us a lot to work from actually in terms of duration of stay, and it paints a very, very different picture, as you'll see, to that of the Magdalenes report, and again I'll get into that a bit more. So that's just a sample of some of the graves. That's not by a long shot all of the graves. Actually, this one here, that's the one I've just been talking about. There's 51 names on that, on those 3 headstones. That's in Glasnevin Cemetery, and none of those women are buried there. The second last one on the right, that's Limerick, which actually, yeah, that's the. I want to, as we're here, I wanted to kind of, in case you guys aren't familiar with this, what happened in 2004, John Gilligan, a local politician here in Limerick, he was at a family funeral in Mount St. Lawrence and noticed that there was a Good Shepherd grave and that there were no names on it. And so John was just outraged when he discovered this, and he I think he basically harassed the church into ensuring, between the bishop and the order and whoever he could harangue into doing it, but he and they didn't tell him, if I remember correctly, that they had done that they had done the job. When they did do the job, he was over one day and discovered they had actually done it, that each woman's name would be on the plot there, because before it was just, it's actually hard to see it, but it's just a simple cross. So in 2004, John invited us.
Former residents.
Residents.
Yeah.
It's a nice passive phrase, isn't it? In 2004, John, he contacted us and we came down, and we had a nice ceremony, and we had a daffodil for every woman that was in the grave, and every woman's name was read out by a woman at the ceremony. So it was, and it's an example of kind of local ownership of an issue. I see it's that Nancy down the end. We haven't actually met in person. Nancy's an example of somebody in. Nancy is in New Ross and would, do a lot of work around the grave in New Ross and ensuring that the women there are remembered. So, as I say, it's again, there's a map on our website if you want to visit the grave, and I'll get into another the Flowers for Magdalenes event towards the end as well. So to date, as Maggie said, we've recorded the details of 1,633 women. Now, not all of the graves are marked, so some of these names, was something I didn't mention is, one of the things that the resources that has been fantastic is, say, the Glasnevin genealogy service. You have to know the name before you actually go searching for the name, which is frustrating, but if you know one name you might get 5 from it, because you can do what's called an extended search, and you get everybody that's in that one sort of spot with that particular woman. So that, we got 100 more names that we weren't aware of. All of these women are in unmarked graves in Glasnevin Cemetery. And I think the Magdalenes report said there were 879 deaths. So, we've got double that going on. So in terms of duration of stay, according to the Magdalenes report, 61% of the women spent less than a year in the laundries. But the Magdalenes committee couldn't access information on admissions for 58% of the women. And so the average duration of stay for the 42% that they did know was actually 3.22 years. But the executive summary in the Magdalenes report used the median, which was 27.6 weeks. So these legacy cases are problematic also, and you'll see why in a minute. So legacy cases, and that's the Magdalenes phrase for them, they're women who entered the laundries prior to 22 and remained there afterwards. They weren't included in the Magdalenes report's statistics for levels of state involvement, and consequently, of course, the committee disclaimed any responsibility for their fate. And in doing so, they dismissed so many experiences that reveal a different reality to that, 27 weeks for the majority. And, before the report was, Magdalenes report was published, as the investigation was ongoing, we brought 141 examples that we had gathered. And these were women who we found in the 1901 or 1911 census, and who we saw on gravestones around the country. So we're saying, and we found that the majority of them spent between 11 and 74 years in the laundries. But unfortunately, this data was ignored. The only women, by the way, that seem to have been taken into account, the legacy cases, were those who died in the institutions after that time, unless they died after the closure of each laundry. These so-called nursing home deaths. If the laundry closed in 1982, deaths after 1982 were discounted, and you'll see in a minute why that's important and very, very wrong. So that's the breakdown of the 141 cases that we would have brought to the Magdalenes committee. you know, the vast majority of them kind of fall between, you know, at least 11 to 50 years, you know, and it's just extraordinary. There's literally no mention of this in the Magdalenes report, no mention whatsoever. And they had access to all sorts of, like, well, they had access to entire records of the religious orders, you know, which they returned when they were done. So it's extraordinary. So just to give you a few examples of some of these legacy cases that were ignored. So this woman, Alice, she's in the 1911 census at 29 years old. She died in 1961. She's buried in St Finbarr's Cemetery in Cork. She was in Peacock Lane, Laundry. And so, you know, she was at least 50 years in Peacock Lane. At least 50 years. You know, Agnes, again, is in High Park. Was in High Park. She's there at 28 years old in the 1901 census. 1911 census, they recorded her name wrong, or her age wrong, and they say she's 34. And then she died in 1967 at 94, so she was at least 66 years. Finally, Margaret, or Maggie, she comes up as Maggie as well. She's here in Limerick, and she's buried out in Mount St Oliver Cemetery. In the 1911 census, she was 18, and thanks to help from Pauline, who's here, we went through. We've got copies of all of the electoral registers from 61 up to 1983. We actually need to go beyond as well. I think there was 82 was when the laundry closed, but Maggie is in every single one of those electoral registers from 1961, which is when they started to record the women. They recorded the nuns from 40s onwards. And she died in 1985 at 92. So she was at least 74 years in the Good Shepherd here in Limerick. And so she's doubly excluded from the Magdalenes report. And what I mean by that is, because she was there before the state was founded, she's a legacy case, and so she's kind of excluded in that respect. But also because she dies after the laundry closed, so she's one of these so-called nursing home cases. She's one woman that would be completely excluded from the Magdalenes report's considerations for statistics. And it's just extraordinary, you know, that an arbitrary sort of a rule would be put in place by the Magdalenes committee that this is where we're going to cut things off. You know, I mean, there's a young woman in 1911. She's 18 years of age, and her entire life is spent in confinement. Her entire adult life is spent in confinement. It's just extraordinary. So the electoral registers are, from our perspective, a really rich source of data. So what we do is two kinds of analysis. First of all, we do a comparative analysis between the various electoral registers themselves. And so for the women that were in High Park, for example, between 1954 and 1955, 63.4% of those women were confined for a minimum of 9 years. In other words, you know, we were able to find them year on year in the electoral registers for 9 years. 63.4%. Again, similar statistic for 55, 56. 61.4% of them were confined for a minimum of 8 years. Donnybrook again has very, you know, from so far the sort of the results are very similar from laundry to laundry. Similar sort of a situation. 54, 55 in Donnybrook, 63.1% of them were incarcerated for a minimum of 9 years. 55, 56, 67.9% of them were there for a minimum of 8 years. And then the second kind of analysis is between the electoral registers and the headstones. So for High Park in 54 to 64, 30% of the names on those electoral registers, I could find them on the headstones and in Glasnevin records. And what that means is that at least 30% of the women who were there between 54 and 64 ended up dying. They didn't get out. They ended up dying in Hyde Park. Donnybrook, the situation is even more stark. Over 50% of the names are on the headstones. In Donnybrook, Donnybrooks quite unusual. That's the graveyard there that's attached to the old laundry, and it's actually like you'll have one or two names on each of the crosses there, rather than a kind of a group headstone. And yeah, so about over 50% of these women that were there between 54 and 64 are actually in that graveyard. So before I go on to the exhumations, I was, if you think that in the context of the Magdalenes report claiming that 60% were there for less than a year, I would dispute that, without a shadow of doubt. I would dispute that. Just that from the bits and pieces that we have gathered, there's a different story to be told. So in terms of the exhumations, this is what got us started. Again, it's sort of, you hear the stories of, there were bodies discovered and stuff like that. It's not necessarily the case. There's and again, I'm kind of giving you a very sort of sketchy view of it here. You can read more in the critique of the chapter 16 of the Magdalenes report on our website. But just to give you an idea of the kind of the circumstances of what happened. In 1992, the Sisters of Our Lady of Charity decided that they wanted to sell some of their land at Hyde Park. The story goes that they lost on the stock exchange. They certainly did seem to be playing around on the stock exchange. I kind of haven't quite made that link. I'm trying, but I haven't quite made that link yet. But they did seem to have losses at around that time. What the losses were, I'm not sure. So the land being sold included a graveyard, St Mary's, and that's it in the photograph there, which had been used between 1886 and 1986. And this was the burial place of consecrates. All women that were also known as auxiliaries. And these were women that were, they supposedly agreed to stay on in the laundries for the rest of their lives, and they kind of became quasi-religious, kind of, but they're not quite nuns, so I suppose part of the inverted commas reward for this it was to be buried on site. So in '92, the sisters decided that they needed to sell some of their land, so these women were going to be moved from this location. So in August '92, the sisters, they make an application to the Department of the Environment, and they're looking at that stage to exhume the remains of 140 women. And the department came back to them and said, no, we want death certificates for the women that are going to be exhumed. And then in January, a few months later, 1993, the further application went in requesting the exhumation license for 133 women. So already you see that they're in trouble. They started out looking for 140, but when they actually go to seek out information in their own records, they're down to 133. And these records, by the way, are not available to the public, so we can't. There's no way we can check them. So in that application in January '93, there were three appendices. Appendix 1 listed 75 women for whom they could get death certificates, and they knew the cause of death as well. On Appendix 2, there were 34 women named, but they didn't know what cause of death, and they didn't have a death certificate. On Appendix 3 were 23 women that were identified only by quasi-religious names, so Magdalene of Succor, Magdalene of Perpetual, Magdalene of Hope, etc., etc. No real names. So after what the Magdalenes report describes extensive correspondence between solicitors representing the sisters and the Department of the Environment and the GRO, the Department of the Environment gave them their excavation licence in May 93. So they then set about, setting out tenders for the excavation job. And so you see here, this is from the solicitors representing the order, that that final line there, that it's vital for our clients that the prices are quoted in respect to the above, as they wish to keep the costs to a minimum. So they were looking for the breakdown between exhumation and subsequent burial, or exhumation and cremation. The tender, which was ultimately won by Patrick Massey, funeral directors, they said that the difference between the cost of earth burial and cremation was so great, bearing in mind they wanted to keep costs down, that burial just wasn't on the cards. But they went on to add that the coffins would be simple with no embellishments and suitable for cremation. And the sisters decided that that was okay, they accepted that tender on, and they actually explicitly state that they don't want any more costs incurred other than that. And canon law is interesting on cremation. The Church earnestly recommends that the pious custom for burial be retained, but it doesn't forbid cremation unless it's chosen for reasons which are contrary to Christian thinking. Now, I leave it up to yourselves to decide whether you think it's contrary to Christian thinking to, for financial reasons, to cremate as opposed to rebury women who have worked for no pay, who had been promised a burial on your site as part of the deal, bearing in mind also that cremation makes it impossible for any kind of analysis after the fact. I'll leave it up to yourself whether you think it's contrary to Christian thinking. So you see, just that's an example of one of the applications for cremation from Sister Anne-Marie Ryan. For one of the women, there was an individual application for each one. So the exhumations began in August 93, and immediately issues start to emerge because they discover that there's an unknown additional remains in the graveyard. So they go back to the Department of the Environment, and they don't know how many additional remains. They say they don't know, and so therefore the department grants them an additional licence. Not long later, actually, on 31st of August, to allow for the removal of all human remains, and ultimately an additional 22 women were exhumed, so that was 155 in total. So the cremated remains of 154 out of the 155 were reinterred at Glasnevin Cemetery. The one woman and her family wanted to take her home. And you see in the photograph there, there's some of the nuns with the urns. The members of the Magdalene Memorial Committee, our predecessors, said that at the time, they were given no notification of the ceremony, and they were tipped off by a journalist, and that was the only reason. They arrived just in time to see the urns go down into the ground. And the Magdalene Memorial Committee continued to campaign for some kind of a memorial to the women, and that's the bench in Stephen's Green in Dublin, which every time we have a meeting at the Department of Justice, it's which isn't that often, we cross the green deliberately, and we'll go and have a little sit down, just to remember the women when we're there. So in 2003, so none of this sort of a lot of that stuff what I've just said, most of that wasn't available in 93. That information wasn't available to the public. People just knew that the women were being exhumed and reinterred, which is bad enough in itself. But everything what I've just told you about the death certificates and all of those issues, they didn't emerge until 2003, which is where we come in. And the late Mary Raftery, we owe her that. She did incredible work, and her partner and Sheila Ahern and her husband agreed to let us see her archive on this issue, so it was hugely helpful in kind of putting together the picture. So in 2013, a decade later, the Magdalenes report fails to provide any kind of answers to it, and there's actually even more to the situation. We're kind of continuously researching this, and I'm currently writing up even more information on the High Park excavations. So, you know, in other words, the line can't be drawn under this issue, you know. So again, that's the critique. That's the very long address there. But I'll give the resources document to Maggie. And just really quickly to give you an idea, it's not just isolated to High Park. You know, these kind of issues. As another example, there's Sunday's Well. That graveyard is behind 12-foot high walls with barbed wire on top of them. You can't access it easily. You know, no exaggeration, we needed ropes to get down, and it's completely inaccessible. There's serious inaccuracies on that grave. There's a 30-year gap of, you know, where no names appear, and you know, no sign, and an equivalent gap in a local graveyard for the other graves. This is the auxiliaries grave. We brought this all to Magdalenes' attention, but again, it's ignored in the Magdalenes report. So in terms of our ongoing research, we're going to continue with our work with the electoral registers, and we're bit by bit we're kind of building up that information. Court records, which have proven helpful for some of the women who would have been put in through that route. Newspaper archives, as I say, the exhumations, you know, that's still a very open issue, and other burial locations. And we also want to incorporate Northern Ireland into this, because while we do have a border between ourselves and Northern Ireland, nonetheless, you know, the orders didn't respect those. Respect is the wrong word, but the orders didn't see those kind of orders in place, because you could be transferred back and forth at any time, and you know, we have testimony from women who that was their experience, especially if they needed to be kind of spirited away and out of sight fairly quickly. No better place than Northern Ireland to put them. In terms of how can you help, apart from the sort, and when I say how can you help, I mean this in the kind of this issue. You could also contact your local TDs in general in terms of the general issue, but in terms of the Magdalene Names project and remembering the women who died, visit a Magdalene grave will be the first thing I'd say. And again, you can access the map on our website. We have also like another map for Glasnevin, because it's a huge cemetery and it's quite hard to find the different graves. So we have that available for anybody that wants to look. And also every year on the Sunday before International Women's Day, so whatever date that falls every year, we have an event called Flowers for Magdalenes, which has been on the go since, I think it's 2012 now. And the idea is very, very simple. It's just simply to come, bring flowers and lay flowers at a Magdalene grave and remember these women. And each area has their own way of doing it. You know, Cork like to do poems and songs sometimes, and Galway will have songs as well. Dublin, we tend to kind of have a few words at Glasnevin's entrance, and then we kind of go around the graves, because there's a number of graves at Glasnevin. New Ross go all out and have flags, thanks to Nancy's hard work, and Pauline here organises the Limerick one. And so what I would say is, you know, if you can make it, you know, I'm sure Pauline wouldn't say no to extra bodies for the Limerick event. And it's a non-political event. It's not. It's the one time we you know, while I'll use the Dublin one to kind of update people on what's going on, if there's any news on the gravestone, it's strictly kind of non-political other than that, because it's just simply to give the women one day a year where everybody just comes and just simply remembers them. And, you know, it's very much a family event. It's a lovely event that, you know, and for the last, I think, 2 or 3 years, every single place, every single city or town that had a laundry has been represented at it. So, you know, as I say, it's strongly, I think it's the 4th of March this year, it's when it falls. But certainly I'd encourage you to come along. And we have a page on our website, which I'm still populating, but with the beginnings of a page on the on Flowers for Magdalenes on the website as well. You can access that from the homepage. And finally, for any kind of information resources, just our website is jfmresearch.com. We have lots of information, different kinds of, you know, whether you want to read our UN reports, issues on the scheme, you name it. If you're a survivor or a family member, we have guides there to help people who you know, want to apply to the scheme. And that's about it. I just want to make sure I leave plenty of time for questions, so I'll stop talking now and let you guys come in.